Thank you very much for coming today and in your lunch hour, so thanks very much. I'm going to be talking about something that's really important to us at Brightwave, which is empathy and engagement with digital learning. This is me, I'm Director of Design at Brightwave. And this is just briefly what we're going to look at today. I'm going to start with a little bit about the latest research on emotions and learning. Then I'm going to look at how that impacts the way we're designing digital learning, and finish with a really practical example of a piece of learning we've done recently where we've taken those principles. So first of all, I'm starting with this quote. It's a famous quote, you'll have seen it before. And I wanted to tell you a story about that quote because when I was preparing these slides, I was thinking, I'm going to use that Maya Angelou quote. And then I thought, I better just check who actually said it. And turns out it was this chap, Carl Booner, I'd never heard of. And I thought it was interesting because the quote is not only relevant to what we're discussing today, but the story of the quote is also relevant because it's misquoted continually to Maya Angelou. I'm not the only one. Now, Carl was an official in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and he said this in 1971. And I think it shows the power, really, of the role that empathy and identification and projection and emotion play in the way we understand the world and the way we remember the world, because I wanted to remember that as Maya Angelou, not some little-known preacher in the Mormon church. Anyway, so this section here, I'm going to dive into a little bit of science, and I hope you'll see the wider relevance of it when we move back into the really practical stuff around the digital learning. Now, for many years, scientists saw emotions and cognition as completely separate. And in fact, there was a strong feeling that you should divide emotion from learning. If you wanted to be able to learn things, you needed to take the emotion out of it because it confused the picture. Now, neurobiological research now is actually showing us that more and more that emotion and cognition are interdependent. And in terms of learning, it's showing us that far from interfering with it, it's actually critical to the process of learning. I'm going to be talking about, just very briefly, two affective neuroscientists. So I thought it would be good to put a definition of affective neuroscience up there. And this field has developed really because the scientists have been able to use the incredible developments in brain imaging so that they can show the biology behind what's happening when people are describing their feelings. They can show where in the brain that activity is happening. So I'm going to reference two neuroscientists. The first one is Antio Damasio, which some of you have all read this book. It's a 1995 book, and it is really questioning that mind-body dualism. So what Damasio did was he looked at a lot of case studies. He worked with his wife, who was doing a lot of research into people with brain injuries. And he tells a story, as a case study in particular, of a guy called Elliot. Now, Elliot was a really successful businessman. He had a happy marriage. Everything was going great for Elliot, but then he got a tumor, and he had to have surgery on his brain. And it damaged that part of the cortex which is around processing emotion. Now, after the surgery, Elliot still functioned perfectly well intellectually, had exactly the same capabilities intellectually, but he was incapable of making decisions. And his whole world fell apart because he could no longer, in terms of he had all that reference, he couldn't remember the emotional impact of any decision he'd ever made. So if he needed to do something like have lunch, it would take him 30 minutes to try and decide where to have lunch. And you can see how significant an impairment that would be for everyone. And Damasio said, I found him an uninvolved spectator in his own life. I never saw a tinge of emotion in my many hours of conversation with him. No sadness, no impatience, no frustration. Now, the key to Damasio's position is that our ability to learn has been central to our success as a species. We're not a particularly strong ape. What have we got over our competitors? Our ability to adapt and learn. And he would tie that ability to adapt and learn into our physical sense of our body and our need for survival. So essentially, what he's saying is that our brain is not a computer. It doesn't learn like a computer. It's developed within a living body. And everything it feels and learns is in relation to that living body and the desire to survive. So we don't learn like a computer learns. It isn't just a set of data. We always learn in association to a social environment and in association to our emotional understanding. He's not saying there isn't such a thing as rational thought, but what he is saying is that basically at the base, our brain is designed for our own survival and it has emotions attached to that. So the next neurosciences that I wanted to just reference was this woman, Imordino Yang, who worked with Damasio. And she's got a couple of really good TED Talks out there. She's a very good speaker as well, if you want to look her up afterwards. Now, what she did was, she's particularly interesting for us because she's an educator. She was a teacher first before she got into neuroscience. And this slide here is at the center of one of her TED Talks. What she did was she took a bunch of subjects and then told them stories. She told them stories that were inspiring about people who'd overcome difficulties in their lives, amazing, kind of admirable people. And then she asked the subjects to tell her how they were feeling at the time. And then she told them the story again and scanned their brain and looked for the activity in the brain. Now, if you look up there, what she found was that the top bits, those bits of orange, that's where the activity is in the brain. Those top two up there are where you feel things in your stomach. So when you say, I felt it in my guts, you did. Because that's exactly the bit of the brain where you felt it. The same place that you're feeling that rush of emotion. Because we map our emotions over onto the bits of the brain that are there for our physical survival. So as we evolved, they're tied into our sense of ourselves as a physical being. You know, there were butterflies in my stomach, probably. I had a lump in my throat, probably. The other thing that's really amazing is down here, that round blob in the middle, that's your brain stem. That's the oldest bit of your brain. It's the first bit that develops when you're an embryo. And it's also the bit that evolved first. That's our bit that we share with the reptiles. Look where you feel admiration. Like, if you damage that bit of the brain, this is amazing in her talk, if you damage that bit of the brain, you can't survive, not even on a life support system. It controls everything to do with the basic processes of your body. And our emotions are deeply, deeply entrenched in our sense of ourselves. So it's quite extraordinary. Now, if you know that about human beings and the way they think and the way they learn, then that is why it's incredibly important to take those things into account when you're designing learning. So to move on to some other elements that are important in terms of the way we learn. Curiosity is critical to motivation. It floods, when you feel curious, it floods that bit of the brain that's going to be receptive to learning. It's about attention. It's also about a playfulness, and you explore different avenues and come back. So it's about increasing your sense of understanding of the world. That's supposed to be a curious cat, not a dead one, by the way. So novelty, another bit of the brain there, the hippocampus, is really important in the formation of memories. And it's more responsive to novel stimuli than familiar stimuli. That's understandable. If you're an animal walking through an environment, you need to know that, whoa, well, what's that? That might be a risk to me. So that sense that we know from our learners that you're giving them something new. It isn't just gratuitous. It is about capturing their attention. So I think we've all experienced this. I hope I won't experience it right now. But you get that blankness that can happen when you feel too anxious, because anxiety creates a sense of cognitive overload. So in terms of creating an environment for people to learn, anxiety is not a great thing. And face-to-face teachers have known this for a long time. You want to create an environment in which people feel relaxed and happy so that they can learn. And they often use, one of the things I'm going to come back to, they often use humour to do that, to put people at their ease. If you think about the teachers at school who made the most impression on you, often they were either storytellers, or they cared about you, or they were funny. And that those sorts of things drew you in. So to go back to that story about Damasio, the importance of the emotional processes in learners is it's the way we take that theoretical knowledge and apply it to a real situation. So the chap Eliot could no longer take all the memory he had and apply it to a real situation anymore. It was just out there and he was grabbing around. He couldn't find it without the emotional connection. So let's think about what that means for the design of digital learning experiences. How could we design both the digital learning and something I'm not going to talk about, I haven't got time to talk about, but the way people encounter that digital learning, which I think is something that, people don't talk about enough, the way they encounter it, how that affects their ability to learn. So very often, if you ask people why they prefer face-to-face, if they do, it'll be, I got away from my desk. And so what do we do with digital learning? We force people to do it in little bits of time when they're distracted by other things. How difficult is it for them to learn in those conditions? I'm not saying I have a solution to that, but I think it's worth thinking about, and thinking about the time that you allow people to do their learning, even if it is digital learning. So the first thing I think that's really important is to think about the human-computer interaction, that interface, as an authentic interaction. So the more that it's like a social interaction you would have with another human being, where your goals are transparent, and that there's an interaction, there's a true interaction between you, because otherwise you switch off, the more satisfied people are going to be with the design of the learning. That means you need to give them some choice. And there's a huge amount of research in terms of face-to-face, in terms of children, that the more they're involved in the choices around there, the more involved they feel in the learning, the deeper the learning will be. So if you allow people to figure things out for themselves, you give them a task and they figure it out for themselves, they have a release of dopamine, which is the same thing that you get when you're playing a video game, and you get that release because you've done something within a parameter and you've succeeded. Whoosh, you get a whoosh of dopamine, and that reinforces the learning. And the same thing in a classroom setting, and the same thing with digital learning. So this is a difficult one for digital learning, because so often you're faced with the binaries of digital design, and that you need to be able to create as open-ended problem as possible for them to feel involved. So the brain doesn't waste time in looking at things that are not relevant to it. If we take that understanding from effective neuroscience, that it's designed to help us survive, if it's not relevant to me, I'm not going to take any notice of it. So one of the first questions I always ask when we're designing learning is, what does it mean to the learner? What is in it for them? I understand what's in it for the organization, but you have to find where it means something to them. Otherwise it will not connect. You're just communicating something that, will just go out into the ether. And this is this is really important. I like to think of visual aesthetics as like the body language of digital. So it's not gratuitous the way it looks. When you're in a face-to-face situation, the presence of the person is determined through their body language, through the connection they're making with you. That's the digital, the visual aesthetics, the interactions. That's the body language of digital. And it's the way it gives credibility and evokes positive emotion. We all know that. You pick up your phone and you're playing on it. It's just like, oh, you get an app that works so smoothly, that knows you, that, oh, it's just great, that body language. And so it's trying to think of, for our digital learning, how can we do that perceived ease of use, and just the tiny little micro interactions even that we don't notice, that are unconscious, when the little way it animates when I like that. It's playing in my brain. Something I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that positive, non-aggressive humour has been, not obviously you can use humour in a very cruel way, but positive, non-aggressive humour has been shown to improve the conditions for learning outcomes. And often humour has a surprise in it as well, which is the benefit of something novel, and it increases attention. And I'm going to show you an example later in which we used humour. So humans are social beings, and the social context is hugely important. And obviously, this slide covers a huge area which I can't cover now, but it is important to think of where that learning occurs in the social connection. And this links into the wider climate within your organization, the learning culture, the leadership. Digital learning on its own can't work if the climate, the social conditions around it are telling the learner a completely different message. So it's important to look at that context. So these are my sort of notions of emotionally driven design. You need to understand and respect your audience. You need to make it relevant to them. You need to tell stories and use humor. They need to be aesthetically pleasurable interactions, and then create opportunities to socialize the learning, even if you, in your role, have little control over the wider culture, which I know can be extremely frustrating, but at least think about how that learning can be socialized. In the example I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So, an example of emotionally driven design from something we've done recently. This is a lovely project. I'm going to just show you some slides, but if you want to look at it in more detail, just go over to our stand, which is over in the corner there. So this project is part of a blended learning solution for Crossrail, and this digital component plays into a face-to-face that they'll have used. Now the audience are people in the stations on Crossrail, and their performance in dealing with customer inquiries is judged monthly by a mystery shopper who goes around kind of assessing how well they're dealing with customer inquiries. And that the mystery shopper found that they were dealing well with availability and visibility, but not so well on scenarios, and they didn't, and knowledge building areas, especially when giving customers directions. So this bit of learning was to help them think about the importance of clear instructions to customers, and also for them to help to kind of embed their knowledge of the network as well. So it starts with a menu, and you walk around, you move around the line, and you meet characters as you go. In this particular case, I've already met Kareem, and I'm about to meet Rupert, but I'll take you back to Kareem because I'm particularly fond of him. So Kareem, this is an animated character, and you say, go and have a look at the animation because it's cute. But this is Kareem, who's trying to get to Heathrow because he wants to go to Las Vegas for a Elvis convention. So I'm not going to do an Elvis impression. You have to go and listen to him. And it's simple motion capture. And the beauty, it's just Adobe Animate. It's nothing fancy. But with Adobe Animate, you just get a little sense of human movement. And it really adds to the way that you empathize with the character. It's very, very simple. And it's really easy to lip sync it, which is great. So Kareem wants to get to Heathrow, and he asks you a question. He asks you a series of questions, and you answer. You choose your question. There's a really nice, there's little gamified elements, giving you lots of visual feedback, a little bit of audio feedback. Now the points here, there is not just one right or wrong answer. So to go back to that, we need to create scenarios where you can do better or worse, not just right and wrong. And then the other thing is that once you've answered the questions, you see what happens to Kareem, because he follows your instructions, and there are 4 possible endings to each scenario. So in this one here, there's a very happy ending, and he actually meets up with one of the other customers, and that story you'll read about later. So it's kind of creating a linked stories and interests. And you see the other character proposing to his girlfriend. And this is the result score, and the way that the results are, you see your results, and you also see where you scored in terms of these are the criteria that the mystery shopper will be evaluating you on. So it's all linked into your performance as well. And you can click on those for more information. And I just wanted to show you, I like the ending of this story. So there's another character, and this is Ruby, who wants to go to Wood Green to pick up her friend Dee to go to a Zumba class. And depending on how well you answer her inquiry, she either ends up at the Zumba class or not. So this is one ending where she ends up at the Zumba class. And there's just the kind of elements of humour, really. So for those who can't read, it says, she and her friend Dee danced the afternoon away at Zumba, where the local Lothario, Dennis, tried to put some moves on her. But she soon sent him packing. I prefer to be free to come and go, she said, laughing. Now what happens if she doesn't get there? Oh, so if she misses her train, she doesn't get there, but Dee has a very different experience. Her friend Dee was disappointed that Ruby wouldn't be joining her, but she went to Zumba anyway. And she was glad she did, because that afternoon she met Dennis, a wonderful dancer who seemed to know all the moves. And although that's 4 different stories, you'll see we've been very careful about not expanding the scope of it. We've used exactly the same assets, just changed the story. So you can create those, you know, quite cost effectively. So this is another view of the map when I've gone through a number of the characters, and you can see my score up in the top corner there. Now, this is part of a wider, I said it was part of a blended campaign, and here's some of the other collateral. And the characters have become so big, they've actually come into real life, and they've been embraced. Literally, that's our learning designer, senior learning designer Ruth Hill up there, who designed this lovely course. And these are the characters, and their cardboard cutouts are going into the stations at Crossrail. And they've got great badges, so if you can actually acquire those badges, real badges, through your points in the course. And they like them so much, Crossrail, that they use them in an ad, which some of you may have seen in Metro. So it's about, when I say about the social, we don't, and the people we're working with don't necessarily have the control over the culture, but they're as much as possible using those and spreading them out socially, using those assets, and spreading the stories socially amongst people to increase the impact of the learning. So if you'd like to come and see that course and any other, come over to Brightwave.